A few years ago, I had an unforgettable New Year's Eve experience that changed the way I see the world forever. I grew up in a small town just outside a big city, a place where everyone knew everyone. Every year, my friend and I went to Joe's New Year's Eve party. Joe's family was one of the wealthiest in town, and they hosted the party in a massive, finished barn on their property. It was the event of the year. That year, like every other, I arrived at 9 p.m. The barn was already packed with familiar faces. There was food, drinks, games, and laughter filling the space. The hours flew by, and before I knew it, we were counting down the seconds to midnight. When the clock struck 12, cheers erupted, and the celebration hit its peak. But I had work that day, and had another early shift the next morning, so I decided to head home shortly after midnight. By the time I made my rounds saying goodbye, it was nearly 1 a.m. I climbed into my car, turned on the radio, and began the 20-minute drive back home. The roads were empty, cutting through endless fields and farmlands under a clear, starry sky. Halfway home, I noticed something strange, a light hovering over one of the fields. It wasn't large, but it floated about 100 feet in the air, glowing faintly. I slowed my car, staring at the light. Suddenly, my radio emitted a loud burst of static that nearly deafened me. I turned the volume down quickly, taking my eyes off the light for just a moment. When I looked back, it was gone. My heart raced. I knew I had seen something. Confused and curious, I pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out of my car. The night was eerily quiet as I scanned the sky, trying to spot the light again. And after a minute of nothing, I sighed and turned back to get in my car. That's when the static returned, blaring from my radio, even though I turned it off. I froze, staring at the car in disbelief. Then I saw it. The light had returned, and this time it was directly above me, no more than 50 feet up. It was silent, except for a low hum I could feel more than hear. The glow illuminated the edges of what was unmistakably a craft. It was sleek and metallic, about the size of my car, but impossibly thin. Panic set in as I fumbled for my phone. I aimed the camera at the craft, but the moment I hit record, my phone started emitting the same ear-piercing static as the radio. Startled, I dropped it onto the pavement. By the time I picked it up, the craft had descended lower, its glow casting long shadows across the field. I bolted back to my car, started the engine, and sped off. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I saw the craft following me. Its lights changed, swirling in vibrant colors that seemed to pulse in rhythm. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but no matter how fast I went, it kept pace effortlessly. Desperate, I turned towards town, hoping the presence of people would deter whatever this thing was. As I neared the town limits, the craft closed the distance, hovering just 10 feet above the ground and right behind my car. The low hum grew louder, filling my chest with vibrations. I finally reached the police station and I skidded to a stop in front of the building. I jumped out and ran inside, shouting for help. 2 officers rushed to meet me. My words tumbled out in a frantic mess, but they followed me outside without hesitation. The craft was still there, hovering over my car. Its lights shifted into a dark, shimmering gray, and the hum intensified. One officer drew his gun and fired. The gunshots echoed into the night, but the bullets seemed to dissolve before they reached the craft. Suddenly, the hum stopped, and in a blink, the craft was gone. The officers stood in stunned silence, visibly shaken. One of them admitted feeling a wave of pain and pressure when the craft emitted its hum. To this day, I have no idea what it was or why it followed me. The police documented the incident, but no answers ever came. I still have nightmares about that night, and every New Year's Eve, I find myself scanning the sky, hoping I'll never see anything like that again. Two years ago, my fiancée Stephanie and I experienced a New Year's Eve that still haunts me to this day. It all began with a call from my mom. She invited us to her New Year's Eve party, a chance for her to finally meet Stephanie and for us to rebuild our somewhat strained relationship. My parents' divorce had driven a wedge between us, mainly because I suspected my mom's drinking was the root cause. Despite my reservations, I agreed. but a last-minute plumbing disaster at our house meant the party was moved to her new boyfriend, Roger's place. From what little she had told me about Roger, he was private, controlling, and didn't really like guests. The thought of spending the evening with an awkward atmosphere didn't thrill me, but for my mom's sake, I went along with it. We arrived at Roger's modest but impeccably clean home. My mom greeted us warmly, but my first impression of Roger was unsettling. He was stiff, reserved, and seemed irritated by the presence of people. When I went into the kitchen to drop off a dish, I noticed a door with a heavy-duty lock on it. It looked completely out of place in an otherwise normal house. "What's in there?" I asked Roger, half joking. His icy glare and curt response, "None of your business," sent a chill through me. Roger continued to glare at me until I finally left the kitchen. The night dragged on. Roger barely interacted with anyone, instead standing near the kitchen like a sentry. His gaze frequently drifted towards the locked door, making it clear that he was guarding whatever lay behind it. Stephanie whispered to me that she was dying to know what was inside, teasing that as a locksmith, I could probably get it open. I dismissed the idea. Roger was way too vigilant. That changed when my mom convinced Roger to leave and fetch a bottle of wine she had left at her place. His reluctance was palpable, but eventually he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Stephanie gave me that look. I knew I'd lost the argument before it even started. I ran out to my car and grabbed a few small tools. I thought it should be enough to open the lock quick. With my tools in hand, I worked on the lock while Stephanie kept watch. It was tougher than I expected, but eventually it clicked open. We slipped inside, shutting the door quietly behind us. The room was pitch black until Stephanie found the light switch. When the lights flicked on, my stomach dropped. One wall was covered in photos of young women, all bound and gagged. A table nearby was lined with jars filled with body parts, fingers, ears, eyes. The air felt heavy, suffocating as my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Stephanie tugged at my arm, her voice trembling. She said we needed to leave now. She was right. I relocked the door and we quickly returned to the living room, trying to act normal. But as we turned to leave, I bumped into Roger. His eyes burned with suspicion as they darted between me and the kitchen. Without another word, he shoved past me and headed straight for the locked door. I grabbed Stephanie's arm and we bolted out the front door, not daring to look back until we were halfway down the street. Even then, I saw him standing in the doorway, watching us drive away. That night, we debated calling the police. Was what we saw real? Could it have been some grotesque prank? But my mom's frantic call an hour later confirmed our worst fears. Roger had kicked everyone out after we left, screaming at her to leave too. I told her what we'd seen and begged her to stay away from him. Then I called the police. They said they'd investigate, but when they called me back the next morning, they reported the room was empty, completely cleared out, and Roger was gone. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of dread that follows me. I see his face in my nightmares and worry he might come back someday. But what haunts me the most is the thought of those women, what they endured, and the fact that Roger still might be out there, free to do it all again. It was supposed to be an unforgettable night, but not like this. Every New Year's Eve, I find myself replaying it in my head, even though I'd give anything just to forget it. It started innocently enough. I was a freshman in college, just dipping my toes into campus life. Samantha, my best friend, and I decided to join a few classmates at a frat party to ring in the new year. We arrived early, around 8 p.m., and the place was just starting to buzz. Music thumped throughout the house, and the smell of cheap beer and cologne filled the air. We found our group and started dancing, sipping on lukewarm drinks. It was barely 8:30 when the yelling started. It was the police. They must have heard about the party, knew there'd be underage drinking, and decided to bust it. The music screeched to a halt and chaos erupted. Samantha grabbed my arm, her wide eyes mirroring my panic. Underage and holding cups, we knew the campus police wouldn't go easy on us. I whispered to Samantha to come on, grabbing her by the arm. I saw another group of people headed out a door that led away from the police shouts. I pointed and dragged Samantha with me as I ran to follow the others. We followed them into a dimly lit hallway, stumbling through a maze of closed doors. Samantha and I had no idea where we were going, and every sound of shouting made my heart beat faster. And that's when we saw him. A guy, maybe mid-20s, stepped out of one of the doors. He had an air of confidence, like he knew the place inside and out. We told him the police were here and we needed to find a way out. He nodded and told us to follow him. He led us down the hall through a narrow exit and out into the cold night air. Relief washed over me as I stepped into freedom. We profusely thanked the guy for getting us out. He laughed and told us no problem, and that he was sorry our night got ruined. We told him it was okay. We were just glad we got out before the police got to us. We told him we were just going to head back to our place before we got into more trouble. As we turned to leave, he stopped us. He said he was actually headed towards another party not too far from here. He said it was going to be more low-key than the one here, and didn't expect any police to show up. I hesitated. Something about him felt off, but Samantha, always the adventurous one, was already intrigued. I told her we should probably try and meet up with our other friends from the party. Samantha said she had already tried texting them, but hadn't heard back from them. I tried to give Samantha a look that going with him wasn't a good idea. She either didn't get it or didn't care. She started pleading with me to go. Reluctantly, I agreed. He introduced himself as Chad, and we started walking. Eventually, we got to a house that was dark, no lights, no music. Samantha and I exchanged a glance, unease creeping in. Chad opened the door to the house. There wasn't a light on. It almost seemed like no one was here at all. Chad then said the party was in the basement. I'm guessing he could tell both of us were a little uneasy. He opened a door and said it was down there. We cautiously followed Chad into the basement. Sure enough, there was a small group of people lounging around drinking from what looked like a fully stocked bar. I did a silent breath of relief. For a moment, I thought Chad was going to kidnap us or something. Samantha and I grabbed a drink from the bar and found a couch to sit at. Chad told us he was going to say hi to some of his friends and left us alone. For a while, it seemed harmless. Samantha and I sat on the couch, chatting and sipping drinks, though the eerie quiet of the party nagged at me. Around 11 p.m., we debated on leaving to watch the ball drop with our friends, and then a drunk guy stumbled towards us, slurring his words and clutching a beer. Samantha rolled her eyes, whispering, "Creeper alert." But before he could even say anything, he tripped. The beer spilled all over me. I jumped off the couch. I was cussing the guy out, wiping a spilled beer off my clothes. When I looked up, he had a pure look of panic on his face. He was almost in tears and apologizing. But the drunk guy wasn't apologizing to me. He was facing a guy in the corner of the room. The guy stood up and slowly started walking our way. The man walked only a few feet away from the drunk guy. He stood there, his presence commanding. He towered over the drunk guy, who was now on his knees, shaking uncontrollably. "You know the rules," the man said coldly. The room fell silent. 2 other people left the room, returning moments later with a chair, a small table, and a hammer. My stomach dropped. They forced the drunk guy into the chair, pinning his hand to the table. Then the man turned to me. The man held out the hammer, as if he wanted me to take it. I froze. I looked at the hammer, then back at the man. I was terrified. Why was this man handing me a hammer? "Here, we take our rules very seriously," he continued. "Spill a drink and pay the price. Since he ruined your night, you are the one who gets to punish him." The drunk guy looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. He said, "Please just do it. If you don't, it'll be worse." Samantha grabbed my arm, whispering, "Let's leave." But no one else in the room moved to stop what was happening. I wanted to leave, but I had the feeling they wouldn't just let us walk out of there. I looked at Samantha, who was in tears. I then looked back at the man, who was still holding the hammer out to me. I took the hammer, my hands trembling. The guy pinned to the chair looked at me in the eye and told me to hit hard or it wouldn't count. My breath caught in my throat. Every part of me screamed to drop the hammer and run, but I knew, deep down, I wouldn't get far. I swung. The crack of bone against metal echoed the room, followed by a scream. My stomach churned as I stepped back, dropping the hammer. The man laughed, patted me on the shoulder, and told me good job. He snapped his fingers, and someone turned back on the music. And just like that, the room returned to normal. It was as if nothing had happened. Even the guy whose hand I just smashed was already walking up to the bar, grabbing some ice for his hand. Samantha grabbed me, and we bolted for the stairs. No one stopped us. We didn't speak until we were outside, gasping for air. Tears streamed down Samantha's face, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. We never told anyone that night what happened. Not our friends, not the police, no one. But every New Year's Eve, I can still feel the weight of that hammer in my hand. I still hear the crack, the scream, and the cold indifference of everyone in that room. It's a night I'll never forget, and it's a night I'll never stop wishing I could.